In 1979, the average salary for the bottom 90% of Americans was $30,000. By 2018, this had risen by 23% to just $37,000. Now, these figures are expressed in dollars at 2018 rates. Now, the rise over almost 4 decades is minimal. In contrast, people in the top 1% of Americans averaged $286,000 in 1979, but their salaries rose 157% to an average of $737,000 by 2018. But the big difference is in the top 0.1% of American society. In 1979, they earned an average of $637,000, but by 2018, their salaries had risen to $2.8 million. When we then consider the total income of these groups in 2018, the difference is even more striking. The average income of the bottom 90% remains at $37,000, but the top 0.1% are getting richer and richer. This is because although the average salaries of the top 0.1% were $2.8 million, they picked up on average another $4.5 million each from other sources, such as interest on savings accounts, dividends from shares, rental income from properties and stuff like that. And this income does not even include the value of their homes, stocks or other possessions. Now, amongst the chief beneficiaries of this massive growth in inequality are chief executives. In the 1960s, a typical CEO of a large American company earned about 20 times as much as the typical worker. But by 1980, this had climbed to 42 times. And by 2019, the average CEO earned around 300 times the salary of the average American. Now, to put these figures into perspective, I'd like you to imagine that every person in America gets paid in cash and in $1 bills. Now, these notes are very thin, they're just 0.11 millimeters thick. So if you stacked up the annual salary of the average American, it would be about 4.5 meters high, about the size of 2 basketball players. If a CEO's pay was still around 20 times that of the average worker, their annual pay stack would reach to the top of the Statue of Liberty, very roughly speaking. Now, in comparison, if we stacked up the salary of the CEO of a major Wall Street bank, who earned around $31 million in 2018, his salary would reach the height of 6 Freedom Towers, the equivalent of a building 3.4 kilometers high. The height of the Statue of Liberty, the height his salary would have been if America was operating by 1960 standards, seems negligible by comparison. And remember, the average American worker earned just 1/20th of the 1960s CEO. But this poor Wall Street banker is positively destitute compared to one tech company boss who earns around $280 million a year. And his salary would reach 31 kilometers into the sky. Now, incidentally, planes cruise at around 10 kilometers. So the Statue of Liberty now looks minuscule, and the average worker's pay isn't even visible. Now, so far we've thought about wages and income. But what if we think about wealth, the measure of a person's total net worth, including all the assets he or she owns? The concentration of wealth in America is in fact astonishing. To take one example, the combined wealth of the bottom 50% of Americans is approximately $255 billion. Now, in 2019, the combined fortunes of just 3 men exceeded this by around $50 billion. Their wealth totaled $301 billion. A year later, one of these men is said to be worth around $180 billion. Such a figure is astronomical in the sense that if he went out of his house in North America and stacked up his wealth in $1 bills, it would pass the International Space Station at 400 kilometers and eventually stop when it had reached almost 20,000 kilometers into space. But you might ask, does it matter if a few people become super rich? Well, yes, because concentration of wealth can affect freedom As the rich get richer, they get more powerful, and they're able to exert greater influence over political decision making. This means their priorities can become more important, and the priorities of the majority become less important. A quote attributed to the former Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, best expresses this concern. We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. So if freedom is important, perhaps addressing income inequality does really matter. Give a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video and subscribe now so that you never miss any of my future posts.